All right, so this is for chapter 29. This is about pregnancy and development. So, first is the right one. Okay, so development is progressive changes that happen, um, and it can be studied before birth. That's called embryology, and then after birth, up until essentially death. There's always a series of changes, cellular things that go on. Pregnancy is specific to the growing of an organism inside a woman, and there are multiple things that change in the anatomy of both the fetus and the woman, and then physiological changes. And then after the baby comes out, the changes within the baby and then the mom, postpartum changes. So first we're going to talk about the prenatal period and the three different shorter periods within that prenatal. Prenatal means before birth. So it begins, again, in the lower left are the blanks that you should fill in. Prenatal period begins with fertilization, when that secondary oocyte, that egg, unites with the sperm, and that forms the first cell called a zygote. And the fertilization actually happens technically 2 weeks into the pregnancy. It's on day of ovulation, which is day 14, 2 weeks. So prenatal ends at 38 weeks after fertilization, which would be 40 weeks after your last period. It can be divided into pre-embryonic, embryonic, and fetal. The first one, pre-embryonic, is the first 2 weeks after fertilization is the pre-embryonic. And there are many cellular changes that go on. Zygote becomes eventually what's called a blastocyst. And the pre-embryonic period ends when that cell becomes anchored in the uterus, when it implants in the uterus. The next 5 weeks are called the embryonic period, from the 3rd week of development to the 8th week. And this is where we see the rudimentary organs first appear. So the beginnings of a heart, beginning of lungs, beginning of these muscles. And it's referred to as an embryo in this stage, 3rd week through the 8th week. In the last period, the remaining 30 weeks of the pregnancy prior to birth, is called the fetal period. So, of course, then the organism inside the uterus is referred to as a fetus. And during this time, that once embryo now grows in size and the organs develop in complexity. This is a very nice figure that overviews the pre-embryonic period, embryonic period, and then the fetal period. Here we have fertilization. In the pre-embryonic period, like I said, there's a series of cellular changes that happen. And here is essentially when a pregnancy can be detected. Then we have the embryonic period, okay, that starts with something called gastrulation, and then starts organogenesis, or essentially the formation of organs. And here, at the end of the fetal period, this is birth. That's what it says there, birth. Then we have development, of course, and maturation over time. We have childhood stages until adult. And then eventually we become reproductively viable, and that cycle will continue. So, in which prenatal period do rudimentary organs form? Hopefully you know that would be the embryonic. Now we're going to talk about fertilization, what happens right after fertilization, what cellular changes happen, and then define implantation and when it occurs and where it occurs, along with the hormones during that. And then outside of the embryo, there are specialized structures that help the embryo develop. We'll talk about those. And then we'll end off talking about the placenta. Fertilizations. Like I said, 2 gametes. So sperm and egg come together to form a diploid cell. Remember, diploid means 46 chromosomes. And it contains exactly half of the genetics of each parent. Fertilization, sex is determined, and it initiates cleavage. Cleavage is a series of cellular divisions. Oocyte, the egg, is viable for 24 hours following ovulation, and the sperm can remain viable in the female reproductive system from 3 to 4 days. So there's a span of about approximately 7 days within a female cycle which she can become fertilized. sperm. There are millions deposited during intercourse, but only a few hundred have actually a chance at fertilizing that egg. And it's attracted to the egg. It can find the egg through chemicals that the egg actually releases. And once it reaches the egg, it attempts to fertilize it. Okay, but only one sperm is able to break through the barriers and fertilize the egg. And I have a video here that I'll show you some other time. It's kind of a funny one. Okay, so here is the nucleus of the egg. Remember that outside the nucleus there's these layers of cells. Closest to the egg is the zona pellucida, that's the white that you see in the image. And then outside of that, we have the corona radiata, like a crown of cells. And here's the sperm trying to make their home there. The first layer, the corona radiata, that crown of cells, the sperm can actually push through the layers, and that's what they try to do. The next layer is through the zona pellucida, and for the sperm to be able to get through that layer, they need the acrosome. And this is called the acrosome reaction. Remember, the acrosome is the cap that the sperm wear. The acrosome releases digestive enzymes, and then from the acrosome, it allows the sperm to get through that last layer. But after one sperm gets through, one head of a sperm gets through, immediate hardening, that's the second word. So that layer will harden essentially when one sperm gets through, it'll throw up like a wall to prevent other sperm from getting in. And this ensures that only one sperm can fertilize an egg. When that happens, there's an immediate fusel of the nuclei of both the sperm and the egg. Like I said, only the sperm nucleus enters the oocyte, so the tail gets cut off. And together, that first cell is called a zygote. The egg has 23 chromosomes. The sperm has 23 chromosomes. You put them together, that forms 46 of the zygote, a diploid cell. Okay, so here's the zygote. Cleavage is a series of cellular divisions that are called mitosis, so a series of mitotic divisions. What happens is when a zygote is formed, it will initially start splitting into more cells. 2 cells, 2 divided into 4, 4 divided into 8. And these cells it doesn't increase in size, it just increases in number of cells. So it doesn't get larger yet at this point. And the reason why these mitotic divisions happen is to create the starting cells, essentially, for the embryo. When it gets to the 16-cell stage right here, when these 8 cells divide again, produces a 16-cell ball, and that's referred to as a morula right here. And those morula cells will continue to divide until they form the next cell, which you can see here, called a blastocyst. This blastocyst, as you can see here, has an outer ring of cells. These are called tropoblast cells. And these will eventually form the chorion. The embryoblast cells, or the inner cell mass right here, eventually become the embryo itself. And the cells within this inner cell mass are pluripotent. They are a stem cell. They can divide into any other type of cell in the body. What this picture shows is the female reproductive system and where these cells are located. Fertilization takes place in the uterine tube. And then as that cell moves through the uterine tube, we see these cleavage stages, the morula right here, and then the blastocyst. So it becomes a blastocyst right there, and then it will have to become burrowed in the embryo lining. So the burrowing is called implantation. And this happens by the end of the first week, meaning a week after fertilization happened. And so day 7 is when implantation happens. It's at this point that then the female body starts secreting, well, not the female body itself, but the urine has a hormone in it. The hormone that's secreted is called HCG, And the cells that secrete it are the trophoblast cells, which are part of that blastocyst. I'll bring you back here to see it. So these trophoblast cells secrete a hormone called HCG. HCG stands for human chorionic gonadotropin, and it tells the woman's body we're pregnant. Okay? And this is very, very crucial. This hormone needs to be high in the beginning of pregnancy because it's going to maintain, here's your word, corpus luteum. That corpus luteum needs to be there at the beginning of pregnancy to release estrogen and progesterone. Remember, those keep the uterine lining thick. By the end of the second week of pregnancy, so 2 weeks after fertilization, that's when that hormone can be detected in the urine. And thus the reason for the pregnancy test in which you pee on a stick, because that hormone is excreted in the urine. And so 2 weeks after fertilization is when you find out for the first time that you're actually pregnant. It is true. The levels of this hormone are high for the first 3 months of pregnancy, but then they do dip off, they lower, and the placenta will take over producing progesterone and estrogen. So this graph shows the weeks of the pregnancy, and it cross-references the HCG hormone right here, and then estrogen and progesterone. And notice how the estrogen and progesterone keep climbing all the way until the end of pregnancy, and then you have the baby, and they drop. All right, so there's a lot of problems, potential problems that can happen in the first 3 months of pregnancy. And this is, any woman can have this happen, any couple. So these chromosomal abnormalities, where the chromosomes don't split correctly during formation of sperm or egg, maybe they're mismatched in fertilization or cleavage, they can happen spontaneously. And if this is severe enough, problems with division, chromosome numbers, it can induce an abortion. In the first 3 months of pregnancy, that abortion is termed a miscarriage. And a lot of times, a miscarriage is undetected. The woman doesn't even know essentially she's miscarrying because it's happening so early, 2 to 3 weeks after fertilization. And some say that as many as 50% of pregnancies actually happen, or miscarriages happen. That's kind of a high number, I think, but it is true that a lot of women experience miscarriage. And it's thought that half of those are due to chromosomal problems, where there's not correct number of chromosomes in the nucleus. So we have the blastocyst inside the uterine lining now. It's implanted, and the woman's body is telling her that she's pregnant. With around that blastocyst, there's going to be other things, extra embryonic membranes that protect the embryo. Okay, assist in nutrition, gas exchange, removal of waste. One of those things is called a yolk sac, and it's the first to develop. This actually doesn't store yolk like it does in chickens, but it's an important site for early blood cell and blood vessel formation, the yolk sac. The chorion is on the outside of the membranes, and eventually this layer that's extra to the embryo will become the placenta, part of the placenta that belongs to the embryo. The placenta itself is highly vascularized, lots of blood vessels, and this is where the exchange of nutrients between the mother and the child will take place through this placenta. Nutrients, waste, respiratory gases. It transmits maternal antibodies. So antibodies that the mom has already produced can be transferred through the placenta to the developing embryo, then fetus. The placenta, this is important, also secretes adequate amounts of progesterone and estrogen to maintain the pregnancy. Also, those high levels of hormones make the breast